Hello, everybody, and many thanks for the invitation to this really exciting seminar. I have been asked to speak about cities as agents of change. Hence, I thought I'd start my presentation with an illustration of the type of change that I think we need. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see a quite old figure now, 10 years old figure produced by colleagues from Oxford University. That is, in my view, a very compelling synthesis of the core challenge we face. That is the relationship between food and nutrition security and socio-environmental security. In other words, the relationship between levels of income and employment, the availability of flows and stocks of natural resources, and the ability of a population to feed itself healthily. For me, this figure is the background that makes the adoption of a systemic approach more than ever urgent. Simply put, in my view, our progress in the global fight against food insecurity and malnutrition will ultimately depend on our capacity to holistically engage with this complex picture, what is commonly known as systems thinking. Systems thinking has been defined as the recognition that complex issues are linked, there are multiple actors in the system and they are connected, and integrated solutions are then required. When we talk about cities as agents of change, we need to keep in mind that to date, the best practical examples of application of systems thinking have indeed emerged in cities, where the interdependent pressures that shape food insecurity and malnutrition very often tend to converge. Two main types of urban innovations connected with systems thinking. In some cases, a systemic approach to food has inspired the establishment of multi-actor food policy and advocacy coalitions, the so-called food policy councils. Whereas in other cases, systems thinking has translated into the design of more joined up, more integrated food policies, or even circular food economies, which also have emerged in cities. And I want to spend a few seconds thinking about circular food economies, because for me, in many ways, they epitomize the central tenets of systemic food thinking. Circular food economies emphasize use rather than exchange value. And this fundamental requirement that regulates their economic transactions raises the need for regular exchanges of knowledge between key actors. Use value can only be defined through collaboration, through collective reflection. Hence, the need for strong collaborative relations between key actors and hence spatial proximity. The most interesting dimension of circular food economies for the purpose of my presentation today is that they originate short supply chains, and I'll come back to this later on. Now, the big question is, what are the challenges that city governments are facing when they try to scale up or scale out these food innovations? What exactly do we need to do to make sure that these innovations are not just confined to urban areas, but bring about wider systemic food change? I will mention today four main challenges that are often interconnected with one another. Challenges about knowledge and research, challenges about investment, regulation, legislation. Let me start with knowledge. As researchers to date, we have very much focused our attention in the field of urban food systems on examples of best practice. We have very much relied on the performative power of case studies, which have quickly made some cities become emblematic for food system innovation, cities like Toronto in Canada, Belo Horizonte in Brazil. We know a lot about those cities by now. What we don't know is why systemic food thinking doesn't emerge in other cities. And failure to produce this knowledge is dangerous. It's dangerous because it will eventually facilitate the unfolding of yet another uneven global food geography, another uneven geography of winners and losers, leaders and laggards. So the first challenge I'd like to mention is about knowledge. It's about mobilizing the capacity of national governments in particular to create connections between municipal governments that seemingly operate within very similar contexts, very similar socioeconomic and political contexts, but that in reality seem to have differential capacities to act, differential capacities in terms of planning, mayoral influence, data collection. Knowledge also means research. I'm calling here for a new research agenda that moves away from examples of best practice, a new research agenda that also moves away from governance idioms such as resilient or smart cities, idioms that tend to reduce the city to a discrete, abstract spatial category that somewhat exists in isolation prior to or as a background against people's lives. Resilient and smart cities are very useful concepts for performance-based governance and evidence-based policy. But performance-based governance and evidence-based policymaking work in some cities, but not in many others. They don't work, for example, in the cities of the South, where they would be stymied by the pervasiveness of informal economies that provide a major challenge to the quantification of urban food systems for evidence-based policy making. So what I'm saying here is that if we want to avoid exacerbating inter- and intra-urban disparities in a global context that's already characterized by uneven power relations, we need a new type of research. We need research that focuses on ordinary practices, how ordinary practices are enacted by citizens who are striving to reconfigure their food environment, and how this is impeded or facilitated by national and global governance modalities. Amongst other things, what I'm calling for here is the development of far more participatory methodologies that draw upon the experiential knowledge of citizens to collect, map, and analyze data, the so-called citizen science. We need, I'm saying it in one word, context-specific information, which is currently absent or insufficient in many cities. Without context-specific information, we will not be able to develop truly progressive food policies and monitor how they translate into enhanced human capacities and entitlements. Another area that needs attention, another big challenge that often falls under the responsibility of national governments is the infrastructure of the food system. I'm thinking here of concepts such as city-region food systems, very much used by FAO in the last few years. Concepts that are drawing attention to the flow of people, material, ecosystem services that entangles urban and rural spaces. If we want to make these flows sustainable, socially, spatially, environmentally sustainable, we need to strengthen the nodal points of the food system. We need to invest in whole-scale markets, food hubs, diversify distribution channels. This investment is vital for the short supply chains to release their potential, the type of short supply chains I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, to release their potential in terms of redistribution of added value, articulation of more inclusive and transparent market governance, and support for local biodiversity, including traditional foods, which are key to diversify diets. Investment as a key entry point, and I want to stress this very clearly. Investment is not necessarily about finding additional resources, which would be a major challenge nowadays. Investment could just be a matter of making better use of already available funding, like those connected with public procurement, for example, one of the most powerful economic instruments we have at our disposal to reform the food system holistically. And not just that, we also need to remember that public procurement specifically focuses on vulnerable social groups that are often at high risk of food insecurity and malnutrition, children in schools, patients in hospitals, elderly in care homes, offering also an opportunity for the public sector to reflect its educational and health prevention or promotion messages in the food it provides. So looking into the future, the time has come to really try to create an enabling environment for public procurement, working to support innovative public food systems, particularly in terms of the metric we utilize for the awarding of public contracts, a metric that needs to provide clear incentives to deliver sustainability and food security outcomes, but also in terms of the investment made in capacity and capabilities, again, the infrastructure of a public food system and the specific skills that are needed to utilize it. Public procurement evokes a final challenge I'd like to mention today, a challenge that is also key to resolve if we want to scale up and out urban food system innovations, the challenge of regulation. I think the time has come to find the courage to address some crucial questions about power. And I'm turning to national governments again here, because I think that national governments should start using their powers to contest the role of global agribusinesses and profit-driven multinational conglomerates that continue to shape urban food environments in complicated ways. What this means in practice, it means reorientating international trade as far as possible towards local needs rather than wants, to ensure that small-scale local suppliers don't have to confront an unfair competition with cheap imports. It means also intervention to ensure prompt payments by supermarkets to their suppliers, or more generally, policy intervention to set clear targets towards social and environmental justice, including, by the way, decarbonization targets. In conclusion, what I've tried to say today is that over the last decades, cities have made very important steps towards the application of systemic food policies. As a vital next step to sustain this effort over space and time, we need to work with national governments and build their capacity to recognize their critical function as links between local and global policy action in terms, as I try to explain, of mobilization of knowledge and resources, legislation, and regulation. Without the involvement of national governments, neither local governments nor global food system actors will be able to identify, to initiate, to sustain the type of political and socio-ecological reconfigurations that are really needed, urgently needed, across cities but also across scales to meet the grand challenge of systemic food change.